इंडिया का वाइडेस्ट नेटवर्क।
बिगेस्ट नेटवर्क, ये तो सब कहते हैं राइट।
लेकिन इससे हमारा क्या फायदा?
मेरी लाइफ इजी कैसे होगी?
वी हियर यू। इसीलिए आपकी लाइफ आसान करने एयरटेल वो करता है जो किसी के लिए आसान नहीं। हम आपसे कुछ नहीं छुपाते, खबर अच्छी हो या बुरी, हाँ बुरी भी हम साफ साफ बताते हैं, ताकि आपकी लाइफ में रुकावट ना आए।
चलो जी।
इंडिया का बेस्ट नेटवर्क आप डिसाइड करना, हम रोज बेहतर बनने की कोशिश करेंगे।
Customers from across India and the world have been leaning on us for over 75 years. Blue Star, built on trust.
जब चलेंगे हम, बढ़ेंगे हम, चलेगा हिंदुस्तान, चलेगा हिंदुस्तान, बनेगी नई पहचान। NBC bearings, NBC bearings।
इस बदलते भारत की आत्मनिर्भर पहचान NBC बेयरिंग्स, लीडिंग बेयरिंग मैन्युफैक्चरर और एक्सपोर्टर, मेड इन इंडिया, मेड फॉर द वर्ल्ड, और CK बिरला ग्रुप कंपनी।
Do you know when trade is at its best? It's when you never have to think about it. When it's so convenient that it almost feels invisible. Trade is at its best when it makes getting something, no matter how big or small, from one place to another, feel like handing it over with your own hands. Making the world flow better. A way to make another country feel like next door. To make a stranger feel like a neighbor. To change what's possible for everyone. For us, trade isn't about running ports. It's about opening portals. Portals to millions of people, but also to a better future.
We are live now. Vipin?
Yeah, no, I think it's the Ankshita first.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to day 2 of CII Being Future Ready Business Summit 2022. This is plenary session 17 on future mobility, innovating to drive sustainability. The session will be moderated by Mr. Vipin Sondhi, Chairman CII National Committee on Future Mobility and Battery Storage. Our panelists include Mr. Vikram Kirloskar, past President CII and Vice Chairman Toyota Kirloskar Motors Private Limited, Mr. Sunjay Kapur, Co-Chairman CII Manufacturing Council, President ACMA and Chairman Sona Comstar, Mr. Salil Gupte, Chairman CII National Committee on Aerospace and President Boeing India, Mr. Sharad Mohan Mishra, President Group Strategy TVS Group, and Mr. Shreyas Shibulal, Founder and Director Micelio. I will now hand it over to Mr. Sondhi to please take this discussion forward.
Thank you, Ankshita, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste to all of you, and I'm delighted to commence the first session of the second day with future mobility, innovating to drive sustainability, a very interesting and topical subject. I also want to extend my own warm welcome to all of you and to our very distinguished panelists who's just been introduced. Let me at the outset, on behalf of CII and on my own personal behalf, thank you all for joining us today for this session. And I sincerely hope that with your participation, an invigorating and engrossing discussion on the transformational change that is taking place in the mobility space, whether on the ground or in the air, around the world and in India, is extremely, extremely interesting. Just a few words as a precursor to this discussion. The pace of change, as all of you know, has been breathtaking, will be breathtaking for the next decade at least, and factors such as technology advancement, long-term cost advantages, convenience, and most importantly, sustainability will redefine the mobility landscape. And the objective is to ensure that every country is net zero and not just zero emissions on the tailpipe. If I were to enumerate the 10 top mobility trends, which even 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, we would have wondered, but now are commonly understood. 1, autonomous. 2, Internet of Things. 3, electrification, including hydrogen-powered fuel cells. 4, mobility as a service. 5, micro-mobility, bicycles, etc. 6, artificial intelligence. 7, smart infra, including smart cities. 8, big data. 9, augmented and virtual reality. And 10, 3D printing. The mobility industry is strongly backed by strong government policy and support, and government is extremely interested in leading the change and facilitating it. The consumers, therefore, all of us, have attractive options from which to choose. In parallel, the government is pushing electric vehicles, alternative fuels like CNG and ethanol blending, charging infrastructure, and of course, green hydrogen. Alongside, the airline industry, and we don't talk about it enough, is increasingly innovating in aircraft design, lightweight materials, more fuel-efficient engine technology, and better air traffic management to reduce the carbon footprint. With this background of a dynamic and rapidly changing environment in the mobility sector, I once again thank our distinguished panelists and the audience for joining us today. Before I invite our first speaker, Mr. Vikram Kirloskar, may I request all panelists to cover in their brief initial remarks how they see the change taking place in the mobility space and where do they see India in the next 8 to 10 years, let's say by 2030, as far as green and connected mobility is concerned. Vikram, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Vipin. I prepared myself for this a little bit so I could keep it to 4 minutes or 3 minutes. And I'd like to say that the world is going through an energy transition fueled by concerns on the impacts of human activity on the environment, on climate change, and energy security. Even as a country, we are concerned on these three items. And recently, many geopolitical developments are going to hasten this transaction. In this context, to my mind, there are three mega trends that will shape the future of mobility the most. These include: one, the fight against climate change is likely to make carbon the currency of the future. It's going to be a tradable item in the future. I think we are looking at carbon taxation, and we have to look at carbon holistically, not just tailpipe emissions. We have to look at the whole ecosystem in the circular economy, right from the start of the energy source to the finishing of the energy source. Be technology agnostic and do what is best based on the power situation in the country. And that's the direction I think we have to go in. The second mega trend, and that has really come after our experience in COVID, in using virtual reality, in using video conferencing. And we are seeing more, 5G will come in, a very high-speed internet, more artificial intelligence. We did a lot of factory work using augmented and virtual reality. And this has really reduced the need to travel, reduced the need for mobility. So how will companies like us, car companies, deal with this in the future? I'm sure with the airline companies as well, that reduction in need for business travel, how are we going to adjust our business as well as the mobility in that direction? And the third one is, of course, the rapid pace of urbanization and urban congestion. You talked about smart cities. How do we plan goods and services in this? How do we plan goods and services movement across the country? How do we do more public transport, more automated transport, more reliable transport in the future? So I think this is in my mind, these are the three most important issues as we go forward. And technological disruptions, innovation are all going to play in the way forward so that we meet the requirements of not only individual users, but also society at large and the earth at large.
Thank you, Vikram. And yes, you stayed well within what you said. But the three trends, carbon as a currency of the future is obviously something that is going to be interesting. We'll talk about it. Reducing the need to travel, interesting again for mobility companies, and the rapid pace of urbanization, cities to be perhaps designed around citizens rather than anything else. Let's move on, and we'll come back to you, Vikram. Sanjay, as president of ACMA, you might want to talk about how supply chains are gearing up to be more resilient as maybe OEMs relook at their business models. But over to you, Sanjay.
Thanks, Vipin, and thanks, Vikram, for setting the tone. I hope that mobility doesn't reduce, especially for our industry and yours. It's interesting how we've now begun to call the automotive industry the mobility industry. And when you talk about supply chain and opportunities to supply, we're really opening up a lot of doors for ourselves in the component industry to not just look at automotive alone, but mobility as an industry and as a service, as you rightly mentioned in your opening remarks as well. A lot of disruption in our industry, a lot of focus on sustainability. The Prime Minister's net zero carbon emission by 2070 is something that's driving a lot of change in our industry. Fossil fuels being the single largest import of commodity is of great concern, and therefore a big push towards electrification. And you talked about this as well in your opening remarks. The two-wheeler and the three-wheeler industry is growing rapidly when it comes to electrification. And that's something that we're also seeing a great push from the government in terms of the PLI schemes that have been introduced to invest in future technologies. We're going to see a lot of investment in the component industry in terms of future technologies, as well as deep localization, something that's been going on for a while, and now it's only going to accelerate this along. This will, of course, bring a lot of advantages in terms of opportunities. If you look at the China 1+ strategy as well. So great opportunities for the component industry. With the FAME 2 scheme and the PLI scheme, we're looking at a large investment or a large opportunity in terms of the 54,000 crores that have been announced with batteries, FAME 2 and PLI schemes for the component industry. Some interesting policies in terms of battery swapping, incentives to create a vibrant ecosystem for startups. And we're seeing a lot of startups come into the auto component industry, especially in ACMA. We're working closely with IIT in Delhi, as well as IIT in Mumbai, as well as the entire startup ecosystem, to see how we can bring about change in terms of technology and new investments in terms of technology in the component industry. When it comes to supply chain, of course, we're faced with a grave challenge today of the semiconductor industry. However, again, this is cyclical and not a structural change. So we're not looking at this as a permanent issue or a permanent challenge. However, these are challenges that we're facing in the component industry and we continue to face. However, there's a lot of investment. Again, I keep coming back to in terms of new technologies, new entrants in not just the OEM space, but also the component space. So, a lot of positives. The future is definitely moving towards EV, and we're looking forward to greater opportunities for the component industry as we move in from the automotive to the mobility industry. Thanks.
Thanks, Sanjay. Lots of points raised, and I'm sure we'll come back to as many as we can cover. Deep localization, startups, and academia. I'm so pleased to hear about the involvement of academia as well. But we'll come back. Salil, over to you. As I mentioned, we don't talk about mobility as much in the air, so very happy to hear your opening thoughts.
Sure. Thank you very much, sir. As you started this conversation, you talked about sustainability of the current stage of aviation, and then the future technologies around autonomous and electrification. So I'll actually talk about both of those elements here in the next couple of minutes. The first one is the existing state of aviation. Of course, India is the third largest aviation market in the world, or shortly will be. Domestically already is. When counting international, it will be there by the middle of this decade, with over 2,400 civil aviation aircraft and cargo aircraft coming into the market over the next 20 years. Now, you talk about that huge growth, you have to talk about it from a standpoint of sustainability, because right now, aviation globally accounts for somewhere between 2 and 3% of all carbon emissions. But in a growth stage like what India is in, we have to make sure that growth is sustainable. And so there's several pillars of sustainability that we can pursue. One, of course, is more efficient fleets. The global airline industry has spent about $1 trillion over the past decade on ensuring that the fleets are of the latest technology. You mentioned engine technology. There's other technologies on the airplane that allow for advanced aerodynamics. And if you go to 1990, the average carbon emission of the fleet today versus 1990 on a per aircraft basis is at about 50% lower than what it was in 1990. So those aircraft fleets do get more efficient given the technology developments that we put into those. And you do see that continuing to evolve. So that's one element of it. Another element of it is working with the airlines on how they operate the aircraft. You mentioned airspace optimization. That's a great example of how flights can come in on shorter routes, leveraging satellite technology to reduce fuel burn and carbon emissions. So we're working on that to make that part of mobility more sustainable. And then another one is the use of sustainable aviation fuel. That fuel, biofuels as some call it, have to come from the right sources. It has to come from truly waste feedstocks. You don't want to be growing necessarily crops for which there's an opportunity cost to do that. But there are significant opportunities in the Indian market, especially to use waste feedstock to fuel aircraft. By 2030, Boeing has a goal of having all of our aircraft to be able to fly on 100% biofuel or sustainable aviation fuel. So that's on the existing aviation side to make sure that growth is sustainable. Then there are true new technologies, which I'll talk about as we continue the discussion. We have a joint venture with the founder of Google called Whisk, and we have a eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing. It is essentially an air taxi. It's a 2-passenger prototype right now. It flies up to 180 kilometers an hour. It has a range of about 20 to 40 miles, so called 50 plus kilometers. And we have done over 1,500 test flights with it already, and those flights have been flawless, no incidents thus far. So that a vehicle, there's many people in this air taxi space. The thing that differentiates our product is we are both electric and autonomous. Many of the products in this space are one or the other. So there's those future technologies also that are coming out that we're very excited about, and we can talk more about that.
Thanks, thanks Alil for laying it out. The eVTOL is exciting, both electric and autonomous. We'll come back to that, but a lot of change that needs to take place in aviation, and it affects us all. We'll come back. Sharad, Sharad from TVS. Sharad, your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Mr. Sondhi, and greetings to all. I think we have one point is very clear that with the visible signs of climate change and rising environmental concerns, there is no other option but for the future of mobility to be driven by sustainability, especially with economy like ours, which is rapidly growing and also urbanizing at very rapid pace. I think that is one of the biggest concern which we need to address as we are growing. I will speak from a two-wheelers point of view because this is what I represent right now here. I think it is enabling this transformation in a very critical way. If I divide broadly into three different aspects, one is from the technology shift point of view, the second is on the policy support point of view, and third being the right forms and ecosystem, which I think all of us in the discussion has briefly covered, which is the most critical part of it. Looking first at the technology shift and speaking from a two-wheeler point of view, the industry has made a significant investment in especially our transition to BS6 emission standard in I think around April 2020. Both two-wheeler and three-wheeler market have seen a steady increase in penetration of electric vehicles. I think that's the fastest moving in electric transformation which is happening in auto industry here right now. And in over 2 years, initially it was led by some of the good startups. And now all the major industry players have announced significant amount of investment as well on this topic. And while we believe India can continue to lead this industry too, because right now from a two-wheeler point of view, India is a key leader in ICE vehicle across the world. I think this leadership need to be maintained, and I think India can deliver it completely. Beyond electric options, the two-wheeler industry is also working parallelly on alternative fuels and plans to move toward D20 as in the roadmap launched recently by Honorable Prime Minister, along with significant investment in this place, as well as on the flex fuel technology, which is also a part. The second aspect of the driving sustainable mobility is that of policy support. From policy perspective, we have from the CII have always believed in the market-led transition and have therefore requested technology agnostic policy framework, basically to let the market decide the way forward on this topic. Ultimately, we believe fight for sustainability is with carbon, not with any specific form of transmission alone. And I think that will be a very critical aspect as we move forward. Third point, which is the last point in this, is sustainable mobility need to be fostered through innovative solution. And I think it's been covered in the previous discussion very, very beautifully, led by right forms and ecosystem. This is my belief that while in India, we heavily focus on the current form of mobility, but I think, Mr. Sondhi, you covered it briefly. There is a silent revolution which is happening in European market, especially or on some of the industrialized market, in which the micro mobility is integrating with the larger mobility form in sustainable form in very, very accurate way. In fact, the carbon footprint by electric bicycle is 1/10 as compared to by electric car. And the distance traveled by a bicycle in Switzerland, I understand, is roughly 25 kilometers, per day. Well, by car is around 35 kilometers. So people are moving towards it, and it is heavily pushed by the urban replanning of urban scenarios. I think this is a great opportunity. This model is also for some of the cities and policymakers from our side too. Last part is the future mobility for all of us here is the ecosystem play. Difficult for one player alone to achieve a desired result, especially with so much unknown in this topic. So integration of ecosystem, including the topic like getting the academia involved in the subject, is in the right form, in the spirit, as well in the clearly defined business model, is the key to success. Collective action will be must to achieve the result we are looking for. This will be my
Thanks. No, thank you, Sharad. Actually, the ecosystem play is extremely important. There are so many factors that need to all fall in line as we move forward. So thank you for covering those 4 points that you did, and we will come back to them. Now to Shreyas. Shreyas runs a clean mobility focused fund. Shreyas, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Vipin, and thank you for having me. I think my fellow panelists have mentioned, I think there are, there are definitely, climate change and economic factors that are going to drive the future of clean mobility. Climate change, of course, 20% of the CO2 emissions are caused by road transportation today. And if you look at the economic factors, I think, one of my fellow panelists mentioned that, fossil fuels are one of India's largest imports. And 2/3 of that consumption is from two and three wheelers, right? So I think, and that's also part of the reason why there's so much focus on those form factors, because there's such a tremendous potential for impact. Our conviction is that cargo logistics fleets are going to be the first adopters, because from a pure unit economics perspective, that's where it's going to start making the most sense. And I think, if we're looking towards the future and the future of the ecosystem, I think, there are definitely a few trends that we can consider. One is localization of components. And I think in my mind, that doesn't only mean, manufacturing of major drivetrain components, but also seeing how we can secure the supply chain for certain raw materials, either locally, or if it's not available locally, how do we make sure that it's a diversified enough supply chain that, regardless of any geopolitical situation, we have a very secure supply chain for those components. I think, again, this may be, looking 1 or 2 steps ahead, but second life of batteries is also going to become, a very critical space. When we're looking at the electric vehicle ecosystem, how do we optimize that to the maximum to reduce any other, adverse impacts on the environment. And thirdly, I think, just like how I think institutional investors have gained a tremendous knowledge of the electric vehicle ecosystem and the clean mobility ecosystem in the last couple of years, and the comfort to invest capital into the space has grown. I think there's also a requirement, from other areas of the financial sector to enable higher adoption of electric vehicles, purely from an EV financing side. I think generally, if you look at the traditional finance sector, if you look at them for a loan for an electric vehicle today, the interest rates are higher, and that's partly because of a lack of understanding of what the residual value is, and understandably so. It's a very new space, and I think that's going to take some time for the entire industry to understand. But I think figuring out models around that is also going to become very critical. So I think those are the trends that I would put out there and mention.
Thanks, Shreyas. Definitely, cost of capital is going to be extremely important, and how do we optimize that? Second life of batteries, very interesting. So we'll come back to some of these points. Vikram, if I might come back to you. First, congratulations on giving Mr. Nitin Gadkari a ride on the Toyota Mirai, the first green hydrogen vehicle to fly here. But 2 questions for you. One is from a thought process on policy for government and also the way industry would look at it. with the vast international experience that you have with Toyota, what would be any couple of thoughts? And the second is that, do you see different countries adopting, especially Japan, adopting different ways of getting to carbon neutral? Is it the electrification route? Is it the fuel cell hydrogen route? Or do platforms are virtually fungible, so to speak? Vikram.
You know, the largest carbon emitter in any country, and including India, is really the energy sector in a lot of places. And India relies 76% on coal for its total electrification requirements, especially in terms of consumption. So I think you have to keep this in mind. Each country has a different profile. If you look at a country like Norway, where most of the power is hydropower, you find the highest sales of electric vehicles because it makes eminent sense to use electric vehicles with 100% hydropower. You have very little carbon in the power availability, and therefore it makes sense to go to zero carbon with the electric vehicle. Sure. Brazil has a different idea. Brazil has done a lot of calculations on ethanol and what's the carbon absorption when they grow ethanol. They have enough water as well. One of the criticism on ethanol is, are you using water to make fuel? Then water is in short supply. But in any case, in Brazil, in their scenario, ethanol hybrid car has half the carbon content of a pure electric car. So I think each country's energy scenario and the future and the future planning on the energy scenario will make will show the direction on how industry has to develop the products for that. As far as Toyota is concerned, we have a common platform, whether it's a pure electric car, a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or hydrogen. Our platform is common. Our three main components of a motor, a battery, and electronics is common amongst all three platforms. And we are trying to see what is best for a country when we introduce models in each country. So that's roughly the way we are going about it. I think it's important to look at each country's energy scenario before you make your own plan.
Very interesting. So by country, it could be different. And the second is, what is interesting is the common platform that goes across all Toyota models. So pretty much anything can be put on it, depending on which market you're focused.
And we are making efforts to localize the common platform.
Okay. Which then brings us on to the opportunities that the automobile component industry has. Sanjay, there just seems to be a huge amount of work that is going to come. And you talked of China +1. There, if you play our cards right, getting supply chains to be resilient more than getting just cost and efficiencies after what's happening, and getting them closer to the home market is going to be extremely important, I would imagine. What about areas like raw material sourcing, skilling, technology? How do you see all this going through in this rapid change that the component industry has to make?
So I think, this comes back to the point of investments, and I think private sector is going to have to invest in technology. The spend on technology today as a percentage of revenue is very low in our industry. It's 0.5%, and that is going to have to drastically change. You talk about supply chain challenges, and we talked about China 1+1, but a key factor here is going to be deep localization. We're going to have to look at not just localization, but also raw material, substitution. We're going to have to cut dependence on imports of raw material. So wherever we can do that, we're going to have to invest heavily in technology. And this technology investment will come either through alliances or joint venture partnerships or through licensing of agreements. So again, a great opportunity in that space. I talked about the fact that, we've got a great industry academia connect with IITs, et cetera, and the component industry is working closely to look for solutions, from a technology perspective in terms of supply chain and raw material. The other point that I want to touch upon is the interconnectedness of the service and the non-service business. There is a great influence of the service business on the non-service business. And when I say this, I mean that the build and design of a non-service business, which is our component and our OEM business, will be determined by the service business. When you talked about your 10 points, you stressed upon shared mobility. And again, mobility as a service, when you look at mobility as a service, it's going to determine what the non-service business, which is the brick and mortar business, is going to do. So again, this is going to have a great influence on the industry. So we're going to have to work together with the shared services business to develop technologies and solutions from the component space for the end consumer. The other opportunities that we're looking at, cybersecurity, radars, LiDARs, simulation, again, great opportunities again for the component industry when we move to electrification, when we go to autonomous, when we look at new technologies. So, these are some of the, the things that we're going to have to look at, from a supply chain, from an investment in technology perspective in the component industry.
Sanjay, thanks. And you mentioned the PLI scheme in your opening remarks, and the PLI scheme is designed to ensure we bring in new technology into the country and incentivize that. So I hope that plays out very well. The other thing which CII is very close to, and you've repeated it more than once, is the industry academia connect, and we are engaged with academia more and more. So it's really good that the more we engage with academia, the more we will invest and get students who are ready then to come straight into industry. Sharad, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a provocative question, if you're up to it. We've had fires recently in the two-wheeler, in electric two-wheelers, while the government has initiated an inquiry. How do you see such incidents? Because it's very important that we do the right things. And what would your thoughts be as to what should be done, but particularly in the two-wheeler space and perhaps with new entrants?
Thank you, Mr. Sandhi. It's a very sensitive topic right now for everybody in the industry, for sure. Let me put it this way. Safety is the most important aspect of any product development, one of the most important aspect of any product development. The EV industry itself has been moved very fast, as well as being led by certain approach in terms of product building and also creating a faster product cycle in the market. I think we should ensure that shortcoming in terms of safety matters need to be avoided at any cost. There is a benefit of certain regulatory environment being placed. There is a benefit of understanding how a robust process and systems are developed to ensure the final product meets the customer requirement, not just from a viewpoint of short-term performance, but a long-term performance. And I think as the industry is maturing towards that point need to be addressed by all the players. And I think the larger OEM in this subject, I will say confidently, are pretty much aware of it and very robust system and process in place. But I also wish and expect that as these results are coming up, a tightening of system and process will be done, and we'll eventually have a product which is very, very safe for the people. We should not come into a point of view that EVs are not safe. Actually, I think it is a process and system which need to be improved. EVs are quite safe in the car industry, at least we have seen in developed markets.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think it's a matter of testing to operating requirements of, and ours is a large country actually, so operating requirements in different parts of the country are different, and abuse, we've got to cater to the fact that there will be some abuse and the vehicle has to stand up to it. Okay, good. Salil, third largest aviation market in the world is India. You mentioned about the average carbon footprint over 30 years has come down world over by 50%, but a lot more to be done. Coming back to the eVTOL, which is interesting, I'm sure, 20 to 40 miles, which means can we vertically take off and land from large balconies? How will this work?
Yes, absolutely. That is the plan, right? There will of course have to be a vertiport infrastructure that is put in place, but it will require less room than say a helicopter requires. The other thing is you'll be able to have a lot more of these vertiports. So I've actually visited our test site, which is out south of Silicon Valley, in Hollister, California, and I've seen it fly right by my head. And I would say about 100 meters away, you can't even hear it coming. It's so quiet. The prototype that we have uses two types of propellers. It uses a vertical, like almost like a series of helicopter propellers that are vertically oriented, and then a propeller in the back to push the aircraft forward using the wings that it has. And I would say that you can have many, many different takeoff and landing sites if you can manage the noise. And that is going to be the key for any eVTOL, is how much disruption does it cause to that environment? Ours doesn't really cause any, but you have to look at that as you look at various competitors in the space. Because if you don't have vertiports or takeoff and landing sites every every few miles, you're going to have a very hard time making this able to penetrate the marketplace.
And rules will have to be set up, laws will have to be framed. There's a whole lot of work that to be done, but extremely, extremely interesting.
Just a quick question on this. How
Yeah,
long will it take to charge one of these aircrafts?
That's an excellent
What is the power requirement?
That's an excellent question. So that is the technology that is still being developed right now. So there's two elements. There's the battery density that's required. That's pretty much there right now to be able to go 50 kilometers. But we need to get the charging time down so that it can do at least a couple of 2 or 3 trips between the time that the aircraft needs to go down for charging, and it needs to be able to charge back to be able to do that 50 kilometers within 15 to 30 minutes. That is one of that charging technology and the electricity infrastructure to be able to achieve that is what is in work right now. Certainly right now, our test facilities in the US, we can do that, but in order for it to be truly available to the world, it has to be operable on every electricity grid without straining it, right? And that is what is being worked on now.
Good. Are there any timelines that have been set even in the US, Salil?
So, we expect to be able to certify it certainly this decade. That is our goal. And our rationale for that is both the electric and the autonomous element of it, right? We think that in order for this to really take off, the autonomous element is key, because otherwise, if you have only a piloted version of this, then it's nothing more than a quiet helicopter. Right. So to allow this to be available to everyone at a price that is in line of a high-end limousine, for example, or it has to be autonomous. And so that's why our timeline is sometime in the second half of this decade. There are other companies that are aiming for before 2025, but their product, while it would be electric, it would have a human pilot.
Okay, good. We look forward to that. Good wishes. Shreyas, cost of capital or cost of the interest rates, and how do you achieve a balance, and how are you working with people who perhaps are your financiers and also with the customer? Do you work on regression models, or what kind of models would you put in position to predict the future? And also look at what the resale value of these vehicles will be for you to fund.
Yeah, so I think we currently the models that are available right now are extremely rudimentary, and it's not really dependent on usage. I think there are some models around battery cycles and also time that has been elapsed. But I think on the way that the vehicle is used and such, I think the models haven't really become that sophisticated yet when it comes to players. I think when it comes to different players in this space, I think what will start to help is, telemetry. I think telemetry and data is something that's quite key to actually, develop a model that's more sophisticated and also that's widely adopted. Because the models right now that are available with financiers for electric vehicles are pretty much proprietary, right? So that's I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it'll evolve over a period of time, but and you'll win some, you'll lose some, but it's a very interesting space that you have. Vikram, coming back to you, technology is evolving. You've been the president of CIAM. What changes do you see as a major OEM player and your wider perspective as to what component manufacturers should make vis-a-vis supply chain and the resilience thereof?
It's a big question. You're talking on the product and the supply chain. As far as product is concerned, and the way we see shared mobility coming up, to my mind, reliability and safety is very, very key. Technology, of course, reducing carbon we've talked about, but also reliability and safety of our products is very key to the future for us. It will make and break players. It will make and break our profitability. So high quality is fundamental in this whole thing. High quality in design. If you see the use of a shared vehicle, a shared taxi, the usage is significantly higher than a personal vehicle. And so you're getting more efficiency out of the same capital. But also it requires a higher reliability and quality levels. So that's one fundamental part of the vehicles. I'm not talking about whether it's be electric or whether it'll be ethanol or etc. In all cases, this is highly essential. The second part of it is, of course, the recyclability of the vehicle. I think as we go forward into a circular economy, how we make our vehicles recyclable and use the same raw material as the vehicle is out of service back into a new vehicle, I think is going to be important, into a new vehicle or any other part of manufacturing, any other parts of the economy. It's going to be very, very vital. Third, on supply chain, COVID has really tested everyone, and I think it's essential. I think as Sanjay talked about the PLI scheme, it is essential we start developing and localizing a lot of our supply chain in India. There are a lot of products which are India competitive because of the nature of the raw material availability in India, the nature of skill availability in India, nature of research which has already been done. So we should focus on those, make as much as possible in India as possible and in the future, and try to, that's the only way I can say we improve the stability of our supply chains.
Very good, and therefore great opportunity. Music for your ears, Sanjay. That then brings me back to how Europe is looking at their supply chain resiliency, and how does India and all of you play a part in let's say the European or the American supply chain. Can you do it out of India, or will you have to make new plants closer to your customer base?
So, Vipin, this is really going to depend on the component. Currently, there's a lot of export. In fact, we grew exports by 76% as a component industry last year. So a great surge in terms of exports. And again, because of the development because the investment in technology, and as Vikram rightly points out, in terms of Make in India, it's also design in India that's going to really be critical for us going forward. And the opportunity to supply into the US, into Europe, and even China, exists for us in the component industry. We're seeing a lot of companies today being able to supply into, the electric vehicle market space as well in foreign markets. And again, to bring scalability and investment and justice to investments in EV, we're going to have to supply to the export markets, because that's really where the volumes are, and that's where the volume is increasing, especially outside of the two-wheeler and the three-wheeler industry. So again, to your point of supplying into Europe, US, and China, I would even add China to that, is a great opportunity, again, based on investments in technology. We're not going to be able to leverage the labor arbitrage for very long. We're going to only be able to supply if we have something which is unique in terms of technology, and therefore, design in India more so is becoming more important, not just make in India, but design in India as well. And therefore, the importance of connecting with academia, the importance of investing in manpower and skilling, in everything, and not just from a product perspective, but also a process perspective. So when you look at Industry 4.0, smart manufacturing, you talk about smart cities, where everyone's talking about smarter vehicles, smarter planes, so again, this is going to be key, is going to be, investment in talent.
And that's going to be key, but I still must compliment you of the number of times you repeated about academia and industry. Do you think, and I now kind of address it to both Vikram and you, shouldn't we be hiring more PhDs than we've ever done before?
Good.
Vikram?
Yes, many years ago, there was Mr. I think Ramaswamy, he was DST secretary, and my first meeting with him, he said, "You guys are just not hiring enough PhDs." He said, "We're also not producing enough PhDs, but you're also not hiring enough PhDs. And how do we increase it?" It's a hard question. I support a lot of the smaller regional colleges. Somehow I've always had a feeling that not everyone in India has got the opportunity to do well or go to top schools, but that doesn't mean that they're not clever. So we tend to support a lot of places from smaller colleges and do common research with those colleges, or joint research, or support their engineering. But this is something I think we need to do in a much larger scale. There's not enough basic engineering. I mean, very basic engineering, when I talk of that, like material science and combustion and many other things not being done in India. It's really limited to a few centers in the world that we need to increase substantially. I think it also involves substantial change or improvement in our basic engineering education. I don't think we have enough science in our engineering education. I have a big problem when I'm asking new applicants and even engineers on the job. I always talk about physics and calculus with them, and I find there's not enough being taught in schools and colleges on basic science. So I think to get this PhDs in, it's a long process. It's not as easy as it sounds. We need to start fundamentally from our education, our methods of education.
No, very well said. And of course, we've all, and you're doing it, supporting lesser known colleges, which is extremely important as well. Sanjay, your quick comment on that.
I think that the short answer is yes. The bigger question is, can we attract more PhDs into the auto component industry and the automotive industry? That's really the big question. And with the shift in technology and the investment in technology and the disruption in the industry, I'm hoping that we're able to attract more PhDs and engineers from the IITs of the world to the auto component industry, because it's always been difficult for us to attract them into our industry. And I'm hoping that this new mobility industry and this disruption brings about a change, and we can attract more of them to our industry.
No, I'm sure if you look at the 10 mega trends, the mechanical engineering part of it, which was the basic thing, is very small now. It's a lot of exciting stuff. Great, nice to hear that as well. Salil, tell us a little bit about air traffic management and what it can do to actually reduce carbon footprint.
Yeah, so I'll give a very concrete example, right? Right now, if you fly on an airplane and you come into approach on an airport, typically what happens is it's a manual process. You'll be literally stepped down, right? So the aircraft will come in at a certain altitude and then it will decline, to 20,000, 10,000, and air traffic control will guide you in, and there will be certain paths into that runway, and there'll be a stack of aircraft at different altitudes. And that's done for safety, right? Because it's a very manual process. But utilizing satellite GPS technologies and melding it with the manual processes today, and then at some point in the future, leveraging smart, what we call smart SkyGrid technologies and 5G, you will be able to have a constant glide slope. Now, today we do have markets where we have that glide slope using technologies called required navigation performance, and that removes that step down, and you're able to have more aircraft in less space safely. Now, you still have to have certain separation today because, again, it is a manual process and you need to stay safe. But as that becomes more automated, as the aircraft of the future are actually talking to each other in that glide path, you'll be able to make the most of that airspace and reduce the amount of actual distance that it takes to come in for a landing or even for a takeoff. And that reduces the amount of fuel that is burned and maximizes the value of the infrastructure that you have. So, when the civil aviation minister talks about all of the new airports that they are building to increase the infrastructure of India, that is excellent. However, it's also about maximizing the infrastructure that you have today in a sustainable and fuel efficient way.
No, and I'm sure with the kind of investments that our aviation industry needs, we will look at the future while designing that. But one more question, you talked about sustainable aviation fuel and waste heat stock. Tell us a little bit more about how are we gearing up in our country for that?
Yeah. So I think gearing up, I think we have a roadmap is what we have right now. There's two things that need to be done. One is the fuel itself needs to be considered, approved for use, and that is an ongoing collaboration with the Indian Institute of Petroleum and a consortium of companies, of which Boeing is one, to try to come up with an indigenous Indian fuel, potentially right now based on used cooking oil, for example, of which India is one of the largest sources of feedstock, leveraging used cooking oil potentially to be turned into aviation fuel. So trying to come up with an indigenous Indian fuel, that's one priority. The other priority then is coming up with a refining and transportation infrastructure for that fuel, because ultimately once you've created that fuel, and you have a place where that fuel is produced, then you have to have a infrastructure to get that fuel to the airports so that it can be blended with fossil fuels, because you're not going to go to 100% sustainable aviation fuel on day one. You're going to go to 10%, 25%, 50%, and then 100%. So, those are some of the things that are needed to make it a reality. But India is one of the world's largest sources of used cooking oil, and that is a key feedstock being considered for these types of sustainable aviation fuels in the future.
Great, exciting stuff, and therefore lots of changes that are going to take place. Thank you for that, Salil. Shreyas, there are about 50 to 60 startups that are envisaging coming into electric two-wheelers alone. And many of them can't invest in terms of capital investment in design work, etc. Do you help them, or are these areas that you look at to see how you can help optimize and get people till they achieve scale to use design facilities?
Yeah, so one of the initiatives that we house under Micelio is called the Micelio Discovery Studio, which is basically a product development facility that's meant to help startups in the electric vehicle space go from pretty much ideation to prototype. We work on a membership model. And our members don't include just startups in the two-wheeler space, but startups across the board working at different component technologies, charging infrastructure, etc., even some larger companies as well. The idea is that we wanted to create a facility, house certain equipment and software, which would otherwise be quite prohibitively expensive for, as you mentioned, it would be quite prohibitively expensive for some of these startups to obtain and use. And while it started out as just a facility that we would provide, it's also evolved into a vibrant community of over 100 members today. In addition to that, we're also exploring other avenues by which we can add more value to our members. I think a lot of them, seek guidance with specific activities, maybe in business development or something else that's maybe a little bit broader. And in light of that, we also are working on putting together, we are not a consulting company, we would like to put together a circle of consultants that can actually add value to our members in that way. So that's the work that we are doing to kind of to lower this barrier of entry to get into this space.
Yeah, no, I think that should be interesting. It will also help a lot of new people come in and use those facilities. Good. Sharad, how fast is the ecosystem, and you spoke about the ecosystem, how fast is the ecosystem adapting itself for two-wheelers in terms of charging stations and other things that are required?
I believe especially on the electric charging ecosystem, what I meant was a larger ecosystem, and I see mobility as a much bigger play beyond electric in general. Especially in the charging ecosystem space, there are multiple ways. One is the large player like Jio, BP, Tata. These are building up a plan to build up a very large scaled infrastructure, which is the most critical aspect of it. There are smaller players who are also trying to build a city-based infrastructure. But I think the challenges in electric charging infrastructure, Mr. Sondi, is very, very big. It is very capital intensive. It need to partner with the grid players very well, especially for the fast charging infrastructure. And one of the big issue which is going to come up, which need to be solved for sure, is how do you optimize network? Because you need to really understand the mobility patterns, where this is where the data and AI comes in place, and the partnership with the larger ecosystem beyond charging and asset players comes in place subject. I think it's in the early stage, but I hope this problem is solved faster. Right now, it is all on a personal charging basis, but the public infrastructure will be the most critical aspect to make the range anxiety and the one of the biggest issue of the electric adoption to be cleared.
No, definitely range anxiety for sure. Swappability is another subject for debate. So lots of things from a policy standpoint that need to be sorted out. Can I now request each of our panelists to perhaps in 1 minute sum up what they would like to as the future of mobility? Let's start with you, Salil.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vipin. The future of mobility in the air is coming faster than we think. For first and foremost, in a market like India that is growing as rapidly as it is, we need to ensure that we grow in a sustainable way. And that is one of the key technology focuses of the aviation industry. A lot is made about, can we go faster, and can we go from New York to London or London to Mumbai in 2.5 hours. And while all of those things are interesting to talk about, they're less important for humanity than the sustainability of the transport that we all want to engage in. Only a small fraction of the world's population has flown at all. And that population is going to want to fly. It's less than 20%. And as they do, we need to make sure that they do it in a way that allows us to meet our net zero commitments so that we can make sure that we avoid the perils of climate change for humanity. And that is whether you're talking about the airplanes that you see through the skies today or the eVTOLs that you'll see in the skies in the years to come.
Very important. So sustainability is the underpinning. Sanjay?
So I'm gonna agree. Sustainability is going to be key. investment in technology is going to be key, driving greater opportunities. And I think the future of mobility is so different from what it is today, that the opportunities that are going to come with the challenges are going to be much, much more than ever before. So whilst people, often talk about the fact that going from ICE engines to EV, we're going to lose a lot of components, etc., I feel that the opportunities are going to be greater because we're going to have an ecosystem that we're going to have to cater into. We're going to have, smart manufacturing. We're going to have different processes, different technologies. And, to Salil's point, the fact is that we're going to have a much wider range of mobility to supply into. So the component industry is going to be much larger than just the auto component industry. It's going to be the mobility, manufacturing and technology industry, more than just the component industry. So I think the future of mobility is very promising, and it's going to be a lot of opportunities for us in the future. Thanks.
For sure, and for young people as well, to be attracted to this industry. Very well said.
Hope so.
Shreyas.
Yeah, I think I definitely concur with my fellow panelists, but I also add, I think your collaboration is going to really start driving the future mobility. Whether it be between between startups where there are pockets of really high levels of expertise in certain areas, because it is an ecosystem after all, or if it's academia and looking for expertise there. I think there is a true kind of symbiotic relationship that's going to come out of all of this, and I think collaboration is really the key to ultimately develop a very optimal product to the consumer. I think that's going to be yeah.
So collaboration and to compete as well, but collaboration to make sure that we all learn together. Now that's excellent. Sharad?
So for me, future of mobility is a very large and complex thing to not getting restricted to only technology. Technology is a very big enabler for future of mobility and being efficient. I will go back with the first thing Mr. Kirloskar highlighted in a very brief note, that no mobility is also a mobility, future of mobility. And the integration of future of mobility with future of work and future of living is going to define very critically how the quality of life will impact. I think ultimately we are solving for that too. And there are like Woven City example of what Toyota is building up, or what Singapore is building up, a new township where they are experimenting this no mobility as a mobility option. Future of mobility option also need to be kept in mind when finding solution for future of mobility. The second aspect, and I have found this, eventually in mobility, we are solving one big issue is congestion. Again, this is a quality of life related matter. And we address congestion all the time with the volume. But the congestion is also a very big complexity phenomena. And volume can be addressed with large public transport systems and roads and other things. Complexity can only be addressed with a integrated mobility and mobility as service as a solution. And that's where technology again play a very role. Ecosystem integration again play a very big role. So just to summarize, I believe, it is a path of unknown. India have a huge opportunity to create a frugal solution which can be applied in the world. What will work in India, I can tell you it will work in many parts of the world too. So I think we have an opportunity to innovate and create something unique. China has done it in some form. I think we have a larger opportunity.
Unique is right, absolutely. What works in India can work anywhere else in the world. Vikram, the last minute to you.
My fellow panelists have really all said very, very important statements. I've been reading a lot of history in the last 4 or 5 years. But so let me just think, I'm just trying to think of what to say. And if I look at the growth of civilization, it's highly correlated with growth of mobility. And I think it will continue that way. Whether it's a developing country where it's important to produce from the rural markets, from agricultural markets to cities, or highly developed countries where they're looking at new ways to go to Mars. Its mobility is going to be a requirement for our civilizations to grow, for the world to grow. What is important, I feel, and I think everyone has touched upon it, is that we look at this growth in mobility and the aspirations of our customers holistically, so that we protect the environment, we protect their lives, we protect safety, we look at our future energy needs as we go ahead. Thank you very much to all the other panelists as well. You've covered a lot of the points. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Vipin, for inviting me.
No, thank you, Vikram, and a good note to close on. The growth of civilizations and the growth of mobility are intertwined, and maybe less mobility as well. I want to thank again all of you. I think it's been very interesting. It's not going to be the last discussion. There's so much happening. And I would definitely say great decade of opportunity for manufacturers, for service providers, for government as far as policy is concerned, and for customers with a choice, with an underpinning of sustainability, and that must be demanded. And finally, again, to young people, this is going to be one of the most attractive industries because it's got 10 mega trends that are going to support it. So something for each one of you. Come join it. Thank you again to our colleagues in CII, and of course, Vikram, Sanjay, Salil, Sharad, Shreyas, for your insights, for your candid views on all aspects of mobility, technology, etc. Thank you very much. We close the session now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.